Good morning from the Atlantic Council Global Headquarters in Washington, D.C. Good evening in Seoul, and welcome to everyone joining us online from around the world. My name is Marcus Garlauskas, and I'm the director of the Indo-Pacific Security Initiative of the Atlantic Council Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. Thanks for joining us for today's event, a strategic review of the 2025 Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit. Now, last week, South Korea was a hub of global diplomacy and trade negotiations, with the APEC Leaders Meeting as a centerpiece. And it was accompanied by a range of other bilateral and multilateral engagements that included a U.S.-South Korea trade deal with a nuclear submarine element, and a key summit between Chairman Xi and President Trump. Now, in partnership with the Korea Interparliamentary Exchange Center, we at the Atlantic Council are proud to be able to hold this discussion to help legislators and their staffs from both South Korea and the United States, as well as a much broader audience inside and outside of government around the world, to understand what transpired in South Korea, why it matters, and what's next. Now, despite the international environment being so dangerous, with the ongoing Russian assault against Ukraine aided by both North Korea and China, North Korea's stubborn expansion of its nuclear and missile capabilities, and then the rising pressure subversion from the CCP against Taiwan, we also, though, have some reasons for optimism coming out of these meetings last week. So today, after keynote remarks by a distinguished guest speaker, we'll be examining both economic and strategic implications of the meetings last week in two separate panels. But before we start, just some brief organizational background. The Atlantic Council is a nonprofit, nonpartisan research institution that's focused on U.S. leadership in cooperation with allies and partners. But we're not a typical think tank. We emphasize action, not just analysis. And our motto is shaping the global future together. Now, today is hosted by two different teams from the Atlantic Council, the Indo-Pacific Security Initiative of the Scowcroft Center, which I lead, and the Economic Statecraft Initiative of the Geoeconomic Center. Now, convenings like this one are integral to the Scowcroft Center's mission of developing sustainable, nonpartisan strategies to address the most important national security challenges facing the United States and the world. Our name honors General Brent Scowcroft, former U.S. National Security Advisor, and his legacy of service embodies his ethos of nonpartisan commitment to the cause of security. For his support for U.S. allies and partners, and his dedication to the mentorship of the next generation of national security leaders. Now, we at IPSI, we produce analysis, we conduct tabletop exercises and war games, we host public and private convenings, and we engage with U.S. allied and partner governments, militaries, media, other key private and public sector stakeholders, all to inform the shape the strategies, plans and policies of the U.S. and its allies and partners to, again, address the top rising security challenges, in this case, in the Indo-Pacific itself. But as the U.S. benefits from strong allies and partners with shared interests, so does IPSI. So we're proud to collaborate today with the Economic Statecraft Initiative of the Council's Geoeconomic Center, and ESI's focus is leading-edge research on sanctions and using economic power to achieve foreign policy objectives and to protect national security interests. They provide policymakers and the private sector with unbiased, data-driven analysis and actionable recommendations for shaping economic statecraft solutions. These are key perspectives as we dissect the trade and tariff discussions that dominated APEC. Now, we're also grateful for our partner, the support of the Korea Interparliamentary Exchange Center that made this event possible. KAIPEC's a new organization that's dedicated to fostering greater exchange and mutual understanding between the Republic of Korea's National Assembly and the U.S. Congress, contributing to the advancements of shared national interests through expanded cooperation. In a moment, we're going to hear from KAIPEC's president, my friend Jim Wayman, who I first met while serving together in Seoul. Jim, he became the president of KAIPEC in June 2025 after a distinguished career as a foreign service officer as a member of the U.S. Department of State over 3 decades. Now, he worked extensively on East Asian issues, including 2 tours at the embassy in Seoul, including as Minister Counselor for Political Affairs, where, of course, he and I worked together while I was the Chief Strategist for U.S. Forces Korea. He's a consummate diplomat and a true friend of the U.S.-South Korea alliance. So, Jim, thanks again for making this possible, and the floor is yours for some opening remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you all for coming today. A special thanks to Senator Ernst for coming today. This must be an extraordinarily busy time, so we really appreciate you taking the time to come and see us. As Marcus said, KAIPEC is non-governmental organization dedicated to improving ties between the Republic of Korea National Assembly and the United States Congress. And that mission seems to me to be particularly critical these days, because as the United States appears to be entering a civilizational struggle with China, Korea can be an extraordinarily valuable partner, as we saw with its hosting of APEC. It has long been my view that Washington decision makers and policymakers and analysts still, after 72 years of the U.S.-ROC alliance, do not fully appreciate the value that South Korea brings to the table, at least the potential value. In addition to its critical geostrategic location, South Korea is today a leader in weapons manufacturing. It has robust military capabilities, and as we've seen in recent months, it can be a very valuable partner in shipbuilding, EV batteries, semiconductors, as well as biologics. And although KAIPEC is funded by the Korean National Assembly, our mission statement is clear that our job is to improve relations between Congress and the National Assembly for the benefit of both our countries. And as I say, I feel that the unexplored potential of partnership with Korea is vast, as witnessed by its successful hosting of APEC last week. So although our discussion today will be much broader than just South Korea, I do believe that APEC and its hosting illustrates the point I'm making, and I look forward to a robust discussion that will enhance many of these points. Thank you very much.
Now it's my honor to introduce our keynote speaker, and I suspect most of you are going to be familiar with her distinguished biography. But just to review, Senator Ernst, the U.S. Senator from Ohio, is the first woman from Iowa, sorry, is the first woman combat veteran elected to the Senate who brings an indispensable level of operational experience to the Congress. She served in the U.S. military for 23 years, retiring as lieutenant colonel in the Iowa Army National Guard. She's a decorated combat veteran who commanded a transportation company in Kuwait and Iraq during Operation Iraqi Freedom. She has a leading role on key Senate bodies that directly address issues raised at APEC, including the Senate Armed Services Committee, the Senate Committee on Agriculture, Nutrition, and Forestry, and the Senate Committee on Small Business and Entrepreneurship. Her committee work puts her at the center of legislative discussions on global defense strategy, supply chain resilience, and economic statecraft in the Indo-Pacific. Her legislative focus consistently emphasizes fiscal responsibility and strong international alliances, including countering the threats from the PRC, a necessary balance as we analyze outcomes of the meetings in South Korea. I certainly could go on detailing her impact in the Senate, but I know we're all eager to hear from the Senator herself, and we're very honored to have her here as our keynote speaker for our first of what I hope is a series of joint events with KAIPEC. So, Senator Ernst, thank you so much for taking the time and your busy schedule.
Oh, thank you everyone so much, and good morning and welcome to this event, and thanks Marcus for the really wonderful, kind introduction. And Jim, you're absolutely correct. It is a busy schedule right now. As many of you know, we are in what is called a government shutdown, but it doesn't mean that we are not focused on so many of these really important issues. And I do have to say, we have so many wonderful public servants that continue to work on behalf of the American people every single day, regardless of where they're located, whether it's here in the United States or abroad. So again, thank you so much for having me today. I also want to thank the Scowcroft Center's Indo-Pacific Security Initiative for this event. Over 100 years ago, U.S. Secretary of State John Hay said about China, "Whoever understands that mighty empire has the key to world politics for the next 5 generations." So, 5 centuries. Let's make that clear. Folks, as an increasingly bolder China seeks to remodel the world into its own image, it's clear China has been on the move consistently, and now they are in our own backyard. Over the past few years, Americans have been no strangers to the Chinese Communist Party's malign actions. They include spying on our homeland, buying up our farmland, which is something very important to me that we make sure doesn't happen, stealing our intellectual property, and funneling deadly fentanyl into our communities. In the face of our number one pacing threats, open aggression, we cannot cede a single inch to China. And no one knows that more than Iowans, which is why, after no new trade deals under President Biden, President Trump has been fighting to get us the best deal. Just last week, President Trump secured China's commitment that they would purchase, at a minimum, 25 million tons of U.S. soybeans annually for the next 3 years. Finally, we have a deal maker in chief who puts Americans first. And that is something we can all celebrate. And as I've long said, I believe in America first, but never America alone. With China on the march, our allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific are on the front lines. When we can deter Chinese aggression starting in the region, we protect our nation's own security. To bring folks together to counter Chinese malign influence, I was proud to make my Convene Act law and in the NDA for fiscal year 2024. This bill increases coordination between the U.S. and COFA nations to curb Chinese purchases of land around U.S. installations on the islands and prevent infiltration. This is just one way we can work together to counter Chinese malign influence. Through my Bipartisan Pacific Partnership Act, we can establish a framework to strengthen the United States' strategic partnerships with the Pacific Islands. The region's future will be shaped by economic resilience, transparent governance, and sustainable development as much as by security. Building on our long-standing partnerships to advance diplomatic, security, and economic cooperation will strengthen our collective ability to counter China's growing aggressive behavior in the region. At the recent APEC summit, we also saw how vulnerabilities in supply chains threaten the region's stability and independence of our Pacific partners. China's copy and paste of our system of export controls on its critical minerals and permanent magnets is a direct challenge to our nation's prosperity and poses significant implications for the national security of the United States. I have consistently called for and supported the Trump administration's efforts to bring more mining and refining capabilities back to the United States and our trusted partners. In looking for sustainable strategies for countering the Chinese Communist Party, the United States must lean on one of its greatest strengths, and that is our leadership. American leadership can bring this coalition of like-minded nations together to protect the security and prosperity of the Indo-Pacific, and I'll continue to pave the way in Congress. Throughout my time in the Senate, I have been a tireless advocate for equipping our warfighters with the capabilities they need to ensure deterrence, the key to peace through strength, while also tackling waste, fraud, and abuse to create a more efficient and effective force. On the home front, I have also led the effort to secure America's farmland from Chinese ownership and other adversaries through my Farmland Act. As we continue to sail into the storm, we must prepare for the challenging path ahead. The American way of life remains at risk as our adversaries continue to encroach on our values and our interests. And folks, the threat is only growing, but we remain on guard. The effectiveness of our ability to meet this threat requires strong leadership and, of course, creative ideas. Together, America will counter anything that comes our way and come out stronger in the end. I know this is going to be a productive day of quality meetings and panels, and I want to thank you so much for the contributions you make to our nation's security and greater ideas for moving together with allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific. So, Marcus, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here today. And again, thanks for all that you do and continue to encourage. We need it right now in these turbulent times. So thank you, everyone, so much for your attention.
Senator, thank you so much for those outstanding remarks. Appreciate you taking the time. And that phrase, America first, but never alone, so vital, so important. And one of the things I think the Atlantic Council's mission and role in today's world is to ensure, but the never alone part remains true as we strengthen our relationships with allies and partners in this really dynamic environment. So I'm pleased to introduce our first panel. So if I could ask them to come to the stage, please. The first panel today will be for our event on rebalancing trade economic outcomes from the 2025 APEC Summit. And so first to the stage, our panelists will be, we're in reverse order here. So I'll introduce in the right order. So go ahead. So first, Ms. Claire Chu, a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council Global China Hub, specializing in national security implications of China's global economic activity, including foreign direct investment and capital flows, and the role of the private sector in China's economic and financial statecraft. Now taking his seat is Mr. Jeremy Mark, a non-resident senior fellow at our Geoeconomics Center and a specialist in political, economic, and financial issues related to Asia and Africa, particularly U.S., China, and developing country debt. And then lastly, we've got Ms. Kiv Donovan, who is going to be our moderator for the first panel of the day here. My colleague as a director of the director of the Economic Statecraft Initiative. She holds extensive experience in anti-money laundering, countering the financing of terrorism, the Bank Secrecy Act, U.S. national security, the Office of Foreign Exit Control sanctions programs, and the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network's regulatory actions. So I can think of no one better to moderate this discussion. So for those online, as well as in the room, you can submit video, voice, or text questions at askac.org. And for those of you who'd like to ask questions in person, you can write your name and question on one of the index cards that you should have been able to pick up on the way in the room. And they'll hand over one of our staff members will hand over the questions to our moderator when we transition to our audience Q&A session. And if your question is chosen, just please raise your hand and someone will be ready to provide you with a mic. Now, if you haven't picked up a card and would like to ask a question, please let one of our staff members know. And I think, Audrey, if you could raise your hand there in the back, she'll be able to provide you with a card if you need one. So, Kim, thank you so much for being a great ally and partner, since the theme for this morning seems to be allies and partners. And I'm really looking forward to this panel. So, Kim, over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Marcus. And good morning, everyone. And welcome to our panel, Rebalancing Trade, Economic Outcomes from the 2025 Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit. As Marcus mentioned, my name is Kimberly Donovan, and I am the director of the Atlantic Council's Economic Statecraft Initiative, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. So this year's APEC Summit concluded against a backdrop of extraordinary volatility in global trade. Over the past 6 months, the Trump administration has intensified its use of tariffs and deployed trade measures as tools of economic statecraft, actions that have sent shockwaves through the global market. In response, China has also begun wielding its own economic leverage in ways that we haven't seen before. Southeast Asia sits in the center of this deepening economic rivalry between Washington and Beijing, and the ripple effects are being felt across the region. On the sidelines of APEC, the long-anticipated meeting between President Trump and Xi resulted in an important truce in ongoing trade tensions. But at the same time, we've seen also a wave of new U.S. agreements with Indo-Pacific nations on trade and critical minerals. However, the summit was not only about managing U.S. And China dynamics, it was also an opportunity to refocus on strengthening intra-regional trade and deepening partnerships with other regional and middle powers. As global trade landscape becomes increasingly fragmented, these efforts will be crucial in helping the region chart a more balanced and resilient economic path forward. So to help us unpack all of this today, we are joined by two distinguished speakers, Jeremy Mark, non-resident senior fellow with the Atlantic Council's Geoeconomic Center, and Claire Chu, non-resident senior fellow with the Atlantic Council's Global China Hub. Jeremy is a specialist in political, economic, and financial issues related to Asia and Africa. He previously worked for the International Monetary Fund for more than 2 decades, where he focused on Africa and Asia, as well as outreach on policy issues related to developing countries worldwide. And Claire is a specialist on China and economic and national security. She is senior China analyst at Janes, and her research at Janes Geoeconomic Influence and Threat Intelligence team focuses on the national security implications of China's global economic activity, including foreign direct investment and capital flows, and the role of the private sector in China's economic and financial statecraft. So both of our speakers bring deep expertise which promises for a very interesting conversation today. So please join me in welcoming them. So Jeremy, I wanted to turn it over to you first, just recognizing kind of some of your experience and background in helping shape some of the APEC summits in the past. So, I mean, from your experience, could you help us set the stage a bit and explain how have you seen APEC evolve as a coordinating body? And what role does it play today in navigating dynamics with U.S.-China relations and their respective engagements in the region?
Thank you, Kim, and thank you to my colleagues who have put this event together today. We really appreciate that you would come out or watch us online. You know, APEC, in a sense, at the moment seems a bit anachronistic in the current global environment of trade tensions, of geoeconomic fragmentation. And if you look back at its origins all the way to the George H.W. Bush administration, you can see that a lot of the ideals that were sort of set in motion at that time do seem a bit, I won't say out of place, but a bit jarring compared with where a lot of trade issues are, for example. You know, the core of the APEC mission was free, open, fair, non-discriminatory, transparent, inclusive, and predictable trade and investment environments. The communique that was released last week by the leaders at APEC did not even include the phrase free and fair trade. So we see this evolution has taken place. On the other hand, excuse me, on the other hand, there was a communique. And that's important because during the first Trump administration, there was no APEC leaders communique in 2018 and 2019. So, you know, there are gains and there are losses, I guess you could say. The real point here is that I don't think any country at this point expects that APEC will become the vehicle for major policy changes, economic reforms on a regional basis. I think they have come to see the organization much more as a venue for, shall we say, soft cooperation. And nothing made that clearer than the fact that the meeting itself had so many bilateral meetings between heads of state, the most important one probably having been the Xi Jinping-Donald Trump summit that we saw on the eve of the meetings. On the other hand, Donald Trump then got on his plane and left and did not participate in the meetings, which left a vacuum for Xi Jinping to conduct his own warm and cuddly diplomacy. Below that, I think there's an important thing that's been going on with APEC for many years, though, that in a sense is more important than all of the headline-grabbing news that we get from the summits. There have been a whole series of long-standing working groups, ministerial meetings in which broad themes for economic cooperation are addressed, discussed, and essentially roadmaps, they call them roadmaps, are written. And very important issues have been addressed that have helped to shall we say, not guide so much, but to serve as guideposts for economic policies in individual countries. And for example, there's been a lot of work done in the past on supply chains, particularly in terms of of IT, on consumer electronics trade, and the interaction of many other industries. So it was very interesting to see in the communique 3 themes that were introduced. One is the work that needs to be done on AI, not necessarily in terms of research into AI, but work on how AI can be used commercially and across borders in the Asia-Pacific region. And remember that when we're talking about the Asia-Pacific and the APEC context, that includes Canada, the US, Mexico, Chile, Peru. So it's truly the Pacific Basin. The other 2 themes were to begin to explore the impact of demographic change, which is having a profound impact on the more advanced economies in the region. And the third is to address issues related to cultural creativity, which could be translated to K-pop, which has become a very important industry and money earner in the Asia-Pacific region. I could go on in this, but I want to stop here, let Claire get her time in, and some of these themes we can come back to.
No, that's great, and thank you again so much for setting the scene for this. I do feel like, Marcus, we should have had like a K-pop Demon Hunters theme song for today's event. But kind of picking up on some of the points that you raised, Jeremy, we have been seeing, obviously, where countries in the region are not only facing high US tariffs, but at the same time, then they're also facing a surge of low-cost Chinese exports. And so, I mean, I'm assuming this is having a pretty significant impact for the regional economy. So I was wondering if both of you could kind of share your own perspectives on how is this dynamic kind of impacting regional economies and how are they adapting? I'll turn to Claire first.
Yeah, sure. And thank you again all for being here today. It's great to see a full room. So in terms of the overcapacity question, I think I'll start with Southeast Asia. And Southeast Asian countries broadly are facing headwinds from both ends, right? This means the large-scale import of inexpensive goods, consumer goods, industrial goods from China, which has damaged domestic manufacturing and domestic capacity, which then prompts governments in Southeast Asia to impose protective trade measures. But then when those products are imported to the United States, they face high tariffs, they face rules of origin restrictions, right? And it puts these countries in sort of a corner when it comes to their economic really autonomy and being able to make smart policy regarding either or both countries. When it comes to China, China is likely to continue its industrial growth strategy. Its production-driven economic planning. In terms of overcapacity, oversupply, under-demand issue that the Chinese government is cognizant of, they are looking at alternative policies to resolve this. For example, industry consolidation, right, within key industries in China, incentivizing demand, so on and so forth. But back to Southeast Asia, we're seeing a trend where China is sort of shifting its strategy, right? This is partly in response to supply chain adjustments. So China has a reduced demand for inputs and resources from Southeast Asia and intermediate goods, components, so on and so forth. So rather than China exporting complete manufactured goods to Southeast Asia, we're seeing China increasingly establishing factories to move production to countries in Southeast Asia. And so effectively, they're sort of reversing the flow of certain products to be processed locally. At the same time, the high-end research and development, the pilot production usually remains in China. And I think that is key because for a lot of Southeast Asian nations, they are looking at this from a place of opportunity, right? On the surface level, these new production chains, China calls it exporting production capacity and shifting supply chain model. So this model on the surface may create local jobs, right? The greenfield investment may enable tech transfer to different countries in the region, but at the same time, there are potential negative consequences, and again, hindering local development, and also really just moving the overcapacity issue upstream, right? In terms of still bringing in resources and components and intermediary goods, so tiers 3 through 9 from China. And so I think I'll move on to then the second part of the question, which is what is Southeast Asia doing, right? How are they responding? What is the impact? And I think the impact really varies from country to country, of course. So rather than a full play-by-play, I think a good example of how some of the measures that are being implemented are playing out. We'll look at Indonesia as an example. So Indonesia is one of the countries that is facing an influx in particular of consumer goods through e-commerce channels, through all the cheap goods you can buy from Shein and Temu and everywhere else. So Indonesia, Thailand, South Korea in particular, I think are facing this issue. So in December 2023, the Indonesian government banned merchants from conducting sales transactions via social media platforms. And this was targeted at TikTok Shop. And after this measure was, this passed, TikTok spent $1.5 billion to acquire a local e-commerce platform called Tokopedia. And after this merger was complete, TikTok Shop essentially absorbed Tokopedia and continued operating legally and consensually in Indonesia, and is on its way to becoming the country's largest e-commerce player. And we're seeing other measures. A lot of them are negotiated on a bilateral level, right, from country to country. Thailand is unable to compete with China in terms of steel manufacturing, so we're starting to see some anti-circumvention tariffs in steel, furniture, and a couple other sectors as well. Vietnam, when it comes to wind towers. So every country has its unique concerns and its unique vulnerabilities, which will come into play, I think, later in the discussion when we're talking about how Southeast Asian countries and how ASEAN can work together in terms of strategy to bolster resilience, to develop economic and financial autonomy or maintain economic and financial autonomy, but also what are the obstacles there. I think these individual strategic interests are really at the core of that.
That's great, and I had actually no idea about the TikTok Shop, so it's really fascinating how things are starting to play out here. I wanted to kind of turn to the Trump-Xi meeting next, because that really, at least in Western media as well, it kind of became kind of a focal point of the meetings, even though it was kind of, as Jeremy noted in your remarks, kind of some of the sideline meetings kind of got a little bit more attention than the actual summit itself. So, I mean, we did see the highly anticipated summit between Trump and Xi during the APEC meetings, and that did result in a limited truce. And as a result of that, I mean, China has secured tariff relief roughly in line with other regional neighbors, while the U.S. gained resumed soybean purchases from China and a pause on the rare earth export controls. From your perspective, does this deal mark a real turning point in U.S.-China economic relations, or is it simply a tactical pause in an ongoing cycle of coercion and counter-coercion? And maybe, Jeremy, do you want to take that first?
I'm gonna come right down the middle. I think it's both a tactical pause and a turning point. I think the tactical pause is very clear. Both countries have pulled back from severe restrictions on technology trade and are going to, while there are still restrictions in place, they are going to ease up for the next year and see if in the course of the next two summits between the leaders, they can reach some form of agreement that might be able to return a degree of regularity to this trade. So in that sense, the temperature has been reduced and it's very much a truce. In terms of a turning point, I think in this case, I'm going to come down a little differently than the senator did, who was extolling the U.S. achievements at this summit. I think that over the last 9 months, China has gotten a very clear read of who Donald Trump is as a negotiator, as a strategic competitor, and they've decided that they can handle him. And they put tremendous pressure on the U.S. by employing levers of economic coercion that they had not really used in the same way before to the U.S., but have used elsewhere. She mentioned soybeans. I think the Chinese looked at the president's popularity in the polls for his handling of the economy, and knew that they could bring tremendous pressure to bear in foreign states by cutting off their purchases of soybeans, and they did. And I think that he demonstrated he was prepared to respond to that by crying uncle. And I think that they have now sort of crossed the Rubicon when it comes to technology restrictions, and have made it clear that they are prepared to tighten, to close the tap on rare earth related exports to the US and other countries in order to ensure that they get something that they need from the US. And I don't think that we're going to go back to a situation in which the US had considerable leverage over the Chinese economy as it's had in the past as a result of all this.
That's a great point. And Claire, do you have any thoughts on this?
And just to, I think, add on a little bit, I think it's important to recognize a couple of things. One is that China is already preparing for a post-US strategy in terms of building alternative trade routes, alternative financial mechanisms and institutions, right? Regional regional forums, for example. And when it comes especially to core national interests like food security and energy security, China isn't waiting around for the US relationship to get back to where it was 10 years ago, or to necessarily take a sudden swerve towards the sort of the win-win partnership that one might have envisioned years ago. And so I think that is a sort of a grounding principle. Is there was some alignment in the agreements that were reached between Xi and Trump, but they didn't necessarily address deeper structural or deeper political issues. And so we'll have to wait and see, with their future meetings or in implementation, what each country expects going forward. And also very quickly too is another point to make is just that China keeps moving the goalpost, right? We've gotten to a place where simply getting our two heads of state in the same room is perceived as a win for the United States. And so if that is our baseline, then our expectations are extremely low for our engagement going forward with the other major power in the world. And so I think as China continues shifting these baselines and these goalposts and the status quo, the US strategy going in and Western more broadly has to reflect where the baseline used to be, where it is today, and where we would like to go in the future.
That's an excellent point, and I mean, both of your points, because it's just been so interesting to see how China is really flexing kind of its economic statecraft tools and measures in ways that we haven't really seen before. And I think we have reset a baseline, and they know exactly the vulnerabilities to kind of pick at. And so kind of going along that theme, I mean, we did see where the concession from Beijing as part of these talks was at least a 1-year suspension on the rare earth export license regime that they threatened. And at the same time, we saw where Washington also struck side deals related to kind of critical minerals with partners like Japan. So, do you, from your perspectives, you think this 1-year reprieve is going to give the U.S. enough time to meaningfully diverse away from Chinese rare earths and kind of some of these different kind of critical vulnerabilities that we have? Or, will this be made a long-term source of leverage for Beijing?
Shall I start? 1 year is not enough time, clearly. And this is an incredibly expensive, complex undertaking that at this point will require the cooperation of many countries, many governments to even begin to build the foundations of a competitive rare earths related industry. China has absolutely dominated the field, completely controls certain key inputs in this very advanced manufacturing. It will take a lot of work to begin to achieve some degree of autonomy. And I think you're really looking at, I've seen a lot of people say a 10-year effort, but I think it's going to take resources that nobody has truly considered yet, just how expensive this is going to be.
Yeah, and the way that China is approaching its critical mineral strategy is really end-to-end. It's highly integrated across entities, across enterprises, across financial institutions, and across regions, right? So we're seeing the pipelines being built from extraction through processing, storage, transport, to export that are all backed by Chinese entities. Where we're seeing project bundled deals being signed in places, for example, Guinea, where you have a major iron ore mine, and then the same company is working on a railway, the Trans-Guinea Railway, that will transport the mined ore then to a new port that they are building, the Morabea Port, and also the Simandou Academy for vocational training to build a talent pipeline to then work the mine and work the railway, so on and so forth in the future. And this is not a unique model for these highly integrated, especially Chinese projects, especially in the extractive sector and in commodities, right? And with Southeast Asia too, we're seeing a lot of investment, again, in logistics, warehousing, transport, East Coast Railway, Lao-China Highway, there's about 5 or 6 more. So all that is to say, I agree with Jeremy, I think the US needs to articulate a comprehensive critical mineral strategy. And when I say that's a strategy that indicates clear targets, clear resourcing, synchronizes ad hoc efforts, because many of them are ad hoc at this point, across private sector, government agencies, the defense industrial base, multilateral initiatives, bilateral agreements, because these are all the channels through which we're pursuing critical mineral security right now, and they are somewhat overlapping or not at all. So I think it's really time that we take this seriously, so that allies and partners that want to join in have a roadmap for where they can add value and where they can benefit from aligning with the US on critical mineral security.
That is a great takeaway and recommendation. That is a huge step, I think, that needs to be taken in developing a critical mineral strategy, because so many of the other strategies that the administration has put forward, whether on AI, energy dominance, they require the critical minerals. So that's a really great point. I recognize we have about 20 minutes left, so please, if any folks in the audience have questions, please make sure to get those in. And for those watching online, you can go to askac.org to submit questions. I did want to, we could talk about the US-China dynamic for a very long time, but recognizing that it really is about APEC and kind of these regional dynamics, I did want to turn back to the regional dynamics and trade pieces of this. So maybe, Jeremy, I'll start with you, because while the Trump and Xi meetings may have dominated headlines, one of the main reasons that Trump was really in the region was for the APEC summit. And so, despite all the additional meetings that happened around its orbit, APEC is ultimately a regional body that seeks to promote free and open trade across the Asia Pacific. But it has been interesting because despite that, we see that intra-regional trade remains stuck at around 20%. And so I was wondering kind of if you have any thoughts on potential structural barriers that are still preventing the kind of greater trade integration among regional partners.
Yeah. First of all, I think 20% of Asia's regional trade is a vast amount of trade. So let's not look at this as they don't do that much trading. There is really extensive trade in goods of all sorts, from the low-end goods you were describing and natural resource up to the most advanced products made on the planet. For example, the semiconductor supply chain involves multiple shipments across borders throughout the production process, and a lot of those borders are in Asia: Taiwan, China, Malaysia, the Philippines, Japan, South Korea. These goods are going back and forth. I think there are two structural issues at play here that may be restricting trade in the broadest sense, and I'll come back to that in a second. One is that the supply chains themselves are directed at the global economy. This is a globalized economy, even if we're talking about the Asia-Pacific region. And a lot of the exports are going elsewhere because that is where the investment has come from abroad. All the American investment in Southeast Asia, elsewhere in Asia, all the Japanese investment throughout. We're seeing rapid expansion, for example, of foreign investment for the first time really in India, to the extent that already over the last few years, the largest source of Apple cell phones in this country is Indian assembly operations. So, I think part of the question of why isn't the trade greater is because the global trade is so huge. But there's another dimension which is that trade is not just trade in goods. Trade is also trade in services. And that's everything from logistics and air transport to telecommunications, commercial banking, investment banking, right to much smaller industries like where animated cartoons are actually drawn and produced, which in many cases are places like Indonesia. So there's much less cross-border trade in these services than there could be. And here the structural issues are really regulatory and legal. You have all of these countries that have different approaches to regulation of these service industries. In some cases, regulations that have prevented even the emergence of competitive industries. But in most cases, the regulations are aimed at keeping outsiders out and favoring the favored local industries. For example, service trade in ASEAN, only about 13% of the service trade ASEAN countries engage with go to other ASEAN countries. Now that figure could be a bit off. It was a little out of date by a few years. But the point is that in many cases, this kind of trade is not taking place. And I would simply point out that if you were to put service trade in the U.S. current account alongside goods trade, you would see that the U.S. Trade deficit is far less significant than just looking at goods trade, because this is a service-based economy now, which has a dominant role in many industries around the world.
I think that's a fantastic point, and I'm glad you brought up the regulatory arbitrage issues. That's always something I'm really fascinated about, of just how do we find different alignment on these issues. I feel like I do have to talk about China again, even though we have really raised some really good points around this. But I mean, recognizing the role that China does play in the trade and economic dynamics of the region. And then on top of that, when you have the U.S. trade policies at play, Jeremy, you previously raised some really good points on the weight that the region feels from China. And I was wondering if you could kind of discuss that a little bit. And then, Claire, I know you and I have also had different conversations just on the role of Hong Kong in all of this. So no kind of specific direct question per se, but I just would love to kind of get your thoughts more on elaborating on kind of the heavy weight that maybe the region is feeling as a result of China, but then also, Claire, from your perspective of what's Hong Kong's role in all this.
Shall I start?
Yeah, Jeremy, if you could
Real
start.
quickly, I think Claire really covered this well already, and I don't want to go back over the same ground.
Yeah.
But I think that there's an overarching point that needs to be made. China is presenting itself to Asia as the voice of free trade and cooperation, win-win solutions to global economic problems. And it's an effective message by and large, particularly by contrast with, shall we say, the widely varying messages that come out of Washington these days on these issues. But I think very few Asian countries have any illusions about China's intentions. China is the biggest force in any room on these matters, and I think many countries, most countries, if not all, are really have seen no interest in engaging in any sort of trade conflict with China. The use of coercive tactics by Beijing has been very clear. Australia, in particular in the Asia-Pacific region, has been the target of this over recent years. South Korea has at times felt the effects, particularly after it put in place the anti-missile system a few years ago that the Chinese objected to, even though it was aimed at North Korean missiles. So I think that China is able to to throw its weight around, but sort of the fist is inside a velvet glove. And the U.S. has been a bit clumsier about this in the last 9 months, and China has taken advantage, at least in propaganda terms, of this contrast.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the countries have been really undertaking a strategy akin to hedging or just preserving their options, right? Because at the end of the day, you can't overcome geography, right? They are maritime neighbors with China, not to mention a host of historic, cultural, demographic ties as well that will never, the US is never going to be able to supplant or to replicate. And so it has a lot more to do with diversifying economic opportunities, taking them when they come, joining organizations like BRICS, not out of a anti-Western sort of motive, but in order to, again, diversify and to maintain relationships. Because, I mean, to be fair, both the US and China have been very fickle when it comes to Southeast Asia.
Can I just add one quick point? That's why the US security umbrella and, should we say, the force of US ideals have been so important over the years since World War II in terms of reinforcing a commonality of interests with many Asian countries. And this is something that is now, I think, under threat. I'm sorry for interrupting.
No, absolutely. And I think that's something that we have to reestablish, right? And I have ideas as to how we can do that. They are not easy, but in terms of reestablishing the credibility, the reputation, the trust, I think it is really important because, again, we're not coming in with some of the same inherent, again, kinship and relation elements that China has as an advantage. And so in terms of how China views its role in Southeast Asia, I might pivot this a little bit, say what China hopes or China's broader vision in terms of how it will engage with Southeast Asia. And that is largely going to be through Hong Kong as sort of a super integrator or a gateway, not just to Southeast Asia, but to many emerging markets, but especially to Southeast Asia. I think for the last, however many years, Hong Kong's role when it came to China was to engage with highly developed Western markets and economies, right? And I think that has changed. And part of the opening towards Southeast Asia in particular has to do with Hong Kong's role in the Greater Bay Area. It has to do with the fact that I think ASEAN countries have the highest concentration of renminbi RMB clearing banks. Also, Southeast Asia was one of the first pilot programs for RMB internationalization in 2009, alongside Hong Kong and Macau. And there are other reasons as well, but Belt and Road participation for one, right? Participation in Belt and Road services that Hong Kong has to offer. So there are already a lot of channels for integration and for greater engagement through Hong Kong. And Hong Kong's also seeking to join the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP, which is largely dominated by ASEAN nations. And Indonesia has recently said it was a priority new member, that Hong Kong would be a priority new member. China is already a member of this organization. And part of, again, what RCEP promotes is regional currency payments and just more interregional integration effectively. And that's, of course, in Hong Kong, China's interest. But a couple just brief priorities. More specifically, when it comes to Hong Kong, would like to be positioned as a primary, very key listing venue for ASEAN countries. Many countries are already issuing panda bonds, for example, serving as the regional headquarters of choice for Southeast Asian countries, and also being the partner of choice or the location of choice for Track 2 dialogues for Southeast Asia as well. Hong Kong has already built a number of regional mechanisms, dispute and legal settlement and mediation organizations that would serve this broader purpose.
That's great. Yeah, I think we're going to really be needing to kind of focus on the role of Hong Kong going forward. I do want to try to get to some of the questions that we're seeing online, but before we do, just recognizing our time, because I know we've talked a lot about China and kind of the Indo-Pacific, but I really want to also kind of get your thoughts on partners like Canada and Japan and Australia, because we haven't gotten a chance to really talk about them yet. But we are seeing where they're also stepping up their economic engagement with Southeast Asia, and just Canada, as one example, is pursuing a comprehensive trade deal with ASEAN countries. And so I just would appreciate your thoughts on could these middle powers play a meaningful role in helping the region reduce kind of some of the different dependencies on Washington and Beijing? Or is this just kind of more par for the course and what we would expect to see? And either one of you, if you have initial thoughts and reactions.
So initial thoughts, China is so highly integrated into logistics, networks, transport systems, telecommunications backbones across Southeast Asia. And that gives China also another inherent advantage in being able to retain and to capture industry groups and industry clusters, supply chains. That's something that'll be very, very difficult and take a very long time, as Jeremy mentioned, for any other third country to come in and to replicate or to really compete with. But also maybe given these inherent advantages that China has in the region, we need to also redefine what winning or what competing looks like, right? We're talking about competing, and competing usually suggests there is a winner and a loser. But recently, I was talking to somebody who had read I think a business management book, and about the concept of infinite competition, essentially, meaning that there is no winner, there is no loser, there is either ahead or behind. You are on this track indefinitely. China will not disappear. The US is not going anywhere. We will both be, working in and around Southeast Asia. So how do we keep abreast? And I think that is another question to answer. But overall, I think regional blocs are going to see a lot of interest from Southeast Asian countries in the near term. We already have the CPA-TPP, the new TPP, which includes Australia, Japan, and Canada as members. And I think for Southeast Asian countries, we have more that have applied for membership or interested in membership. So I think there is a huge appetite for multilateral cooperation and for finding new partners and new channels of economic and trade diversification. So I think there is, again, a lot of openings. It's just a matter of positioning, right, ourselves with a strategic outlook.
That's great. Jeremy, do you have any?
Real fast, because I know people want to ask questions. Japan has been fully integrated in the rest of Asia from before China's emergence. It retains an important role in fostering cooperation, and it needs to do more. South Korea has also played a very important role in this process. And I would add a third country, which is Taiwan. And we tend to overlook Taiwan. Taiwan is actually a member of APEC and has, it's a low-key role, but it is there. And Taiwan's own advanced industries are increasingly making their presence felt much further away. For example, I mentioned Apple's growing reliance on Indian assembly for phones. That assembly is largely being done by Foxconn, one of the largest Taiwanese companies. TSMC, one of perhaps the single most important semiconductor company in the world for its fabricating abilities, is spreading its investments out. It needs to do more in Asia, including Southeast Asia, and I'll leave it there.
We have so much to unpack. I know we only have a few more minutes, and this has been a great discussion. Thank you. I did want to take a question from online, and then if there's any questions from the audience in the room, bear with me. This is a new system. So we do have a question from Dr. Tran Chi Trung. And his question is related to, China is going to host the 2026 APEC summit. And so what do you think the priorities will be China? What priorities will China likely promote, and how might these impact regional trade?
It's difficult to answer just looking at how much has changed in just 1 year in terms of regional trade and the actors involved. But I imagine some of the ongoing interests in Southeast Asia will remain, like increased integration more digital, e-commerce, fintech type projects, AI initiatives, which then require renewable energy efforts as well. So increased collaboration across all of those sectors. More integration, again, financially as well, our RMB internationalization, opening up trade in goods and services. Jeremy?
The last time China had the pen, so to speak, was about 15 years ago. I attended a finance minister's ministerial, so I was in the room for a day. China was, at that point, a very quiet chair. It was letting others sort of lead the conversation. I don't think that will be repeated next year. I think China will be much more active. And along with what Claire said, I think a lot of how China devises the agenda and drives some of the work to be done going forward will be determined by how the relationship with the U.S. evolves in the coming months.
No, that's a really good point. It has, I know it's kind of been a general theme, I guess, from our entire conversation, but just the U.S.-China trade dynamics, I think, is going to really be informing what happens in the next 12 to 18 months. I just want to see, were there any questions in the audience?
My name is Namun Kim, and I'm interning for Committee for Human Rights in North Korea. And my interest is in the relationship between U.S. and South Korea, or Korean Peninsula. And I was just wondering how you evaluate the negotiation that was between U.S. and South Korea.
You're turning to me.
That's a Jeremy question.
Given how attenuated relations have been at times between Washington and Seoul when Trump has been president, I think that what happened last week was cause for some relief. I think that the Korean president handled the American president quite adroitly. Gold will always get to his heart. But I think more fundamentally, the sense I get is that the working groups underneath did work hard to find a way to carve out some productive agreements that were more constructive than one thought might occur, even a few months ago. The U.S. willingness to, shall we say, ease up on this demand for $350 billion of Korean investment in the face of very practical issues like what would be the impact of this kind of capital outflow on the exchange rate of the Korean won was, I think, a moment that you could appreciate that people were in the room who understood real issues on the ground in these kinds of economic relations. So I would say overall probably that agreement was the highlight of the president's trip to the region. I don't want to overstate this because I think that there are many issues that are of great concern now, particularly that Trump is talking about once again going to meet with the North Korean leader, which can always introduce unexpected developments into the relationship with South Korea.
Great. I think at this point we'll end there. Thank you so much, both Jeremy and Claire, for your discussion today, and thank you all for joining us. We are going to break for a quick 10-minute coffee break right after that, so please enjoy refreshments out in the hall. Thank you.
All right, just let everyone know one of our speakers is running just slightly late, so we're going to And welcome back. I'm Marcus Garlauskas, again, Director of the Indo-Pacific Security Initiative. I hope you're all able to catch our first panel, where we focused on the economic and trade aspects of the discussions last week in South Korea, including not just the APEC Leaders Meeting, but also summits like the U.S.-South Korea Summit, and of course the meeting between President Trump and Chairman Xi. So now on our next panel, we're going to be broadening the scope, though, beyond the trade and economic aspects, the bigger strategic picture. And so this is going to include discussion of issues that range from the security implications to the alliance implications, the diplomatic aspects of what transpired last week. And so our moderator for this panel is going to be Adam Kozlowski, and Adam is a non-resident senior fellow with the Indo-Pacific Security Initiative. He's got a range of experience and has actually been one of our more prolific authors and co-authors on a series of pieces since he became a member of our team. He previously has served in the United States Senate supporting the Armed Services and Foreign Relations Committee members. So he brings an aspect of an understanding of the legislative process and issues in the United States, which I think is really appropriate given the fact that this event is co-sponsored by the Korea Interparliamentary Exchange Center. So thanks again to Jim and to his team for supporting this event, and I look forward to the conversation. So Adam, over to you.
Thank you, Marcus, and thank you to IPSI and to CAPEC and to the Economic Statecraft Initiative for hosting this event with us today. I'm going to take a brief moment to introduce our distinguished panelists and then give them a minute also in the same order to give opening remarks, and then we'll move to my questions and then to questions from all of you and from our online audience. So I want to start to my immediate left here with Dr. Amy Seawright. She's a non-resident senior fellow at the Indo-Pacific Security Initiative at the Atlantic Council's Scowcroft Center. Dr. Seawright has a vast experience in the government covering defense, diplomacy, and development. She most recently served from 2016 to 2020 as a senior advisor and director of the Southeast Asia program at CSIS. Before that, she was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for South and Southeast Asia from 2014 to 2016. Prior to that, she served as a senior advisor for the USAID, and prior to that, she was a senior advisor on the policy planning staff at the Department of State on APEC issues. Next, to my middle here, we have Dr. Sayuri Rome. She is a Washington-based German Marshall Fellow, senior fellow on the Indo-Pacific program. She leads work on Japan and heads the Japan Trilateral Forum. Her research focuses on US-Japan relations and security issues in the Indo-Pacific. Dr. Rome was previously an associate director of programs at the Marine and Mike Mansfield Foundation. She was also a fellow at RAND Corporation, as a Stanton Nuclear Fellow, and a public policy fellow at the Wilson Center. And then to my far left, we have Dr. Sun Yun. She's a senior fellow and director on China at the Stimson Center. Her expertise is on Chinese foreign policy, US-China relations, and China relations with neighboring countries and authoritarian regimes. From 2011 to early 2014, she was a visiting fellow at the Brookings Institution, jointly appointed by the Foreign Policy Program and Global Development Programs. From 2008 to 2011, she was a China analyst for the International Crisis Group, and for 5 years prior to that, she worked in Washington, D.C. on US-Asia relations. Thank you, and please join me in welcoming our distinguished panelists. So I'm now going to turn to you, Dr. Seawright, to give some brief remarks on your outtakes of this very important APEC summit.
So I don't know how brief I'm going to be because I actually want to step back a little bit and look at the history, a little bit of give us some historical context to what we saw in Seoul with the big questions being asked about, what is the impact of APEC, how efficacious is it at a time when, US-China rivalry is so significant. And, I started working on APEC, as you mentioned, as a special advisor for regional economic cooperation in 2003, 2004, and then subsequently worked on the policy planning staff. And so this was during the Bush administration. And APEC was the centerpiece, really the central pillar to the US's regional strategy at the time. But going back even further, APEC was founded in 1989. Bill Clinton, as president, launched the Leaders Meeting in 1994. But when APEC was first launched, in the 1990s, there was early ambition, high ambition, that APEC could be used as a negotiating platform for real trade agreements that would amount to something akin to NAFTA or the EU, kind of regional blocs. This fell apart, this idea fell apart in the 1990s not because of China, but because of US-Japan conflict over trade. And so at a time when the effort was to negotiate sectoral trade deals that would be building blocks for a larger regional trade agreement and/or building blocks that one could take to the WTO to get global sectoral deals, the United States and Japan came to blows over these binding negotiations, and so they collapsed. And the ambition around APEC subsided to just become more of, rather than a platform for real negotiations, more of an incubator for ideas. But it was held up still as a place where you could move towards what was subsequently called, in the Bush years, a free trade agreement for Asia, the FTAA, Asia Pacific, the FTAAP. And so there was still a high level of ambition, at least in terms, rhetorical or symbolic vision. And then what happened subsequently in the 2000s was the emergence of another stumbling block, which was the difficulty China started to pose to get real things done in APEC. But another thing happened, which is that the United States engagement with APEC really waned in recent years. Clinton, of course, kicked off the Leaders Meeting. President Bush had a perfect attendance record to APEC for 8 years. President Obama had a pretty good attendance record, plus he joined the East Asia Summit, which was created in 2005. And so he went between those two summits, he went to most of them. But then when we've seen Trump and Biden administrations, attendance has really fallen off. And part of that was because of COVID, but part of it was just a lack of presidential level commitment to show up to the region and really engage in the forum. So the other thing that happened was the creation of the East Asia Summit in 2005, which really was an ASEAN-centered, ASEAN-owned forum and includes all of the ASEAN members, whereas APEC significantly does not include 4 of the smaller Southeast Asian economies: Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, and now Timor-Leste, which is a new member of ASEAN. So 4 members are not in APEC, plus APEC has Latin American economies, and so it has sort of the regional focus is a little bit diluted. So when asked what is the significance of APEC to Southeast Asia, it still is a very valuable platform for practical cooperation, working in workshops and sharing best practices. It's going to improve the regulatory environment for particular sectors, and that helps draw in investment. So it's not insignificant, but the idea that this was going to be the forum that brought together leaders of the Asia Pacific and pushed forward an ambitious trade agenda has really fallen off. And there's a lot more focus in Southeast Asia on the ASEAN-centered institutions.
I'm going to turn now to Dr. Vermey.
Yeah, sure. So I think it is, well, first of all, thank you so much for including me on this panel. And I'm a specialist on Japan, so I will be focusing on Japan and Japan's new leader, and how this leadership will have an effect on the region. And I think that it is important to note that Japan really witnessed a big shift in its domestic politics in the past year or so. Where the ruling party, the LDP, the Liberal Democratic Party, which was in power uninterruptedly, almost uninterruptedly since the mid-50s, really lost its majority in both houses. So the LDP lost its trust. It lost its popularity. It is in decline for various reasons, scandals, and the inability to appeal to younger voters, and of course the many internal divisions of within the party. And recently, the LDP also lost its coalition partner, its historical coalition partner, the Komeito, and now its new coalition partner is the Japan Innovation Party, which is also a conservative party. So I wanted to give you a little bit of context first, because although we have this brand new Japanese prime minister, the first female prime minister, there's a lot of enthusiasm about her outlook on foreign policy, on the region. Things are still a little bit uncertain on the Japan side, as Japan has been in a little bit of political turmoil this year. Now, what does this new leadership mean for the region, for the partners of Japan? So first of all, Sanae Takaichi, the new leader, she supports a strong military in Japan. She supports a rise in defense spending. And she even called for an early revision of defense documents, national strategy documents. She's promoting changes in the defense industry in Japan. She will also be continuing what her predecessors did about the region in terms of continuing the free and open Indo-Pacific vision. That's something that Takaichi has mentioned many times, and especially an emphasis on preserving the rules-based order and fighting for any change of status quo. That's definitely something that's on her mind a lot. And to talk about Trump's visit, this last visit to Takaichi, I think it went well in the sense that it went very smoothly. Prime Minister Takaichi really tried to focus on her connection with, her personal connection with her mentor and predecessor Shinzo Abe, and Abe's friendship with President Trump. So I think she managed to personally impress President Trump. So Japan will clearly, has signaled a clear continuation of strengthening Japan-US relationship and strengthening of the alliance for sure. But I must also say that the new Prime Minister of Japan acknowledges US unpredictability. She was talking about how the US under Trump is unpredictable as an actor at an event in Taiwan earlier this year, I think. So she does know that there is unpredictability on the alliance with the U.S. So I think we will see under her an enhancement of relationships and partnerships with ASEAN, with Australia for sure. She will be trying to keep up the momentum for the Quad framework. That's very important for Japan. It's a little unclear how the U.S. will be continuing to engage with the Quad because President Trump and the Trump administration prefer a bilateral approach instead of a multilateral approach. Takaichi will probably also emphasizing the Squad with the Philippines. It seems like she had a really good meeting with the new president of South Korea, Lee Jae-myung. So we will be seeing how that works out. Maybe we can talk about that in the Q&A. One note on the Taiwan issue, if I may. Takaichi is a staunch supporter of Taiwan. So what we will see under her is an enhancement of substantive but unofficial ties between Japan and Taiwan. So a lot of personnel exchange, information exchange, Diet member delegations, technological cooperation. That said, I think it's important to note that foreign policy is not a top priority for Japanese voters. That's the case for every country, I guess. But in Japan, voters are mostly focused on economic growth, on jobs. So I think Takaichi will have to balance her enthusiasm for foreign and security policy with what's happening at home. And so her leadership and her party's position are not the strongest right now. So I wanted to caveat that. While the new coalition partner seems ideologically aligned, more aligned with the LDP than the former coalition partner, their coordination is new, so it's not clearly defined yet. So I think the main points are that Takaichi, the new Prime Minister of Japan, has a very difficult job of reviving the economy domestically, navigate a tricky foreign policy with some U.S. unpredictability, and also navigate the increasingly threatening security landscape in the region. So,
Thank you.
Very difficult.
Dr. Sun.
Sure. Well, a couple of observations before. Well, of course, APEC this year is a multilateral event, but I think most people are spending most attention on the U.S.-China aspect of it. So I think from the Chinese perspective, this is a multilateral gathering, but it's primarily a bilateral angle, at least for this year. And also, let's remember that the Chinese President Xi Jinping, since he took power in 2013, he has not yet missed a single APEC summit. So the consistency says a lot about the level of importance attached to it. In comparison, if you look at the ASEAN summit or the BRICS, we're seeing Xi Jinping gradually sending the Chinese premier to attend. So he is prioritizing. And another related note to APEC is that next year APEC will be here in the United States, in Florida. So when the Chinese talk about a potential Xi visit to the United States, it most likely will be tied up to that. Going back to the APEC summit this year, looking from the Chinese perspective, because I see this as a US-China event, there was some significant disappointment in China before October 1. And this is primarily because while the Chinese were counting the calendar, they saw that the Malaysia summit is on these dates, and then the APEC summit is on these dates. There are 2 days in between. And from what the Chinese had been speculating that potentially there would be a Trump visit to China, they were thinking, perfect, there are 2 days. And he could have scheduled something into his Asia trip, but it became very clear on September 19th when the TikTok deal was announced that Trump was not going to visit China, at least not for this time. I think the Chinese had a sense of a deflation of the expectation of what the next step of the trade deal would look like. So now, of course, the BIS 50% rule came out, and that really became an escalatory event in the trade negotiation. But let's take a look at where China is now after this trade deal negotiated in KL, announced in South Korea. I think the Chinese first conclusion from this event is that US and China have entered what they call strategic stalemate. Translated in English, it's called equilibrium. I think on the trade front, the Chinese believe that an equilibrium has already been achieved with the United States, which in my view is a very dangerous and risky belief, because they see that the US has certain measures that can impose significant damage on China, and China now has rare earths that China has the ability to counter-impose significant damage on the United States. So using the nuclear analogy, they believe that somehow a mutually assured destruction capability had been achieved by both US and China. And that forms the foundation for some level of stability. May not be entirely wrong for as long as Trump administration focuses and prioritizes trade issues. Because if you look at the non-trade domain, everything from Taiwan to Xinjiang, Tibet, Hong Kong, South China Sea, there's no good news there, right? So for the prioritization on trade, the Chinese believe that they have achieved something there. And that could potentially lay the foundation for a more stable relationship with the United States, at least in their view. And what does that lead to? That leads to an unprecedented level of boldness and confidence in the Chinese policy community. They see the United States, they see that for the first time ever, Beijing achieved the ability to hold a critical choke point over the US national interest. And the conclusion is that we're going to use it repeatedly. Whenever there is a next issue that's bubbling up between US and China, rare earth is going to be the Chinese answer. Regardless of whether that's South China Sea or that it's Taiwan, arms sales to Taiwan, senior level visits to Taiwan, rare earth most likely is going to be what the Chinese will use to throw back at us. And their response, from what we learned this round, their response is not going to be proportional. Proportionality is no longer a rule of the road from the Chinese perspective. This will not be just one issue for one issue, that the Chinese response will be proportional. And I think that's another potentially extremely destabilizing tendency on the Chinese policymaking side. So this boldness, this confidence is visible. Using the Chinese characterization that, well, if equilibrium has already been achieved, what we're looking at is that two great powers, relatively independent from each other, are trying to reduce their critical dependence on the other side. And what that essentially means is that when they look down the road, 5 to 10 years, decoupling is still the key word. China is trying to develop their own capability for, look at their energy self-reliance, and look at their own investment on the semiconductor industry, and look at what we are doing in order to diversify our sources of rare earths, critical minerals. Then I would say that both powers are trying to develop their independence or their ability to protect their national security away from the other side's ability to impose damage on it. So that eventually is still decoupling. Whether a decoupled US and China, however you define it, and degree that the decouple will come true, is that going to be stabilizing or destabilizing? I think that's a curious question that for strategic review, maybe we should be reviewing or looking into. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you all. And I think as a former legislative staffer, one thing that I'm looking at when I'm listening to these panels is how can we distill actionable ideas or recommendations for actual solutions. One theme that I've heard across this panel and the last panel was looking at the importance of showing up, right? The consistency that I think you, Dr. Seawright, talked about of the early years, Bush had a perfect attendance record, and now we're seeing Xi and China really show up to these events in consistent ways, and how that goes a long way in diplomacy. So Dr. Seawright, I'm going to turn to you first and talk about you've been across all 3 Ds, the defense, development, and diplomacy. How do you see all of these different tools of statecraft integrating into a summit like APEC, into engagements with ASEAN, and how do you see that showing up principle important here? Is there importance in the consistency aspect of these tools of power and how they're being deployed in the region to counter China?
Yeah, absolutely. Really important to use all 3 and integrate them together. And I wish I could be a little more sanguine about this right now, but I mean, so, let's start with the positive side. On the defense side of things, U.S. is still the preferred security partner for most countries in the region, and U.S. security partnership and defense cooperation, continues apace. It's very strong. It's very valuable to these countries. It's very high level in terms of the skills and interoperability and convergence of strategic pictures that it brings. And the United States still has just tremendous advantages over other security partners, although others are, just like in economics, countries in the region really are looking to diversify their security partnerships, not just in some cases by doing more with China, but Japan has really stepped in a major way, Australia, India, there are many other security partners in the region. We see that, lattice work, as some call it, growing. That's the security side. On the economics, on the development side, of course, the United States has long been a really tremendously valuable partner in development. The way that U.S. traditionally has done development has been very helpful for building up strong, resilient communities and societies. And the dismantling of USAID, I mean, I don't think I need to tell this audience how incredibly devastating that is to what is sometimes called the United States soft power, but it really goes, beyond just an image of helpfulness. It really allowed the United States to work in really tangible, on-the-ground ways with with governments at times, sometimes more civil society, groups, businesses, to really build up, again, strong economies that were regulated in ways that not only help them develop well, but would help multinational businesses or American businesses invest in productive ways. And I could go on and on and on about that. And then on the economic side, the United States used to be the leader of the free trade regime. Not only have we stepped back from that leadership role in terms of WTO, but and the global multilateral system, but in the regional context, we pulled out of the deal that we negotiated, a very high ambition deal of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which, by the way, just as an aside, was really birthed at APEC, which is one of the values that APEC has. It does bring these economic leaders together, and on the margins, they can talk about things and come up with ideas, which led to the P3 of 3 economies coming together in an economic partnership that was expanded to the P4, and that was the basis of TPP. And all of these deals were kind of launched at APEC. But anyway, putting that aside, several administrations now have walked away from not only the what is now called CPTPP, this high ambition regional framework, but has walked away from doing any kind of trade engagements that is mutually beneficial, really trying to trade exchange concessions that will open up both economies or all economies involved in, provide reciprocal access in ways that will, what the Chinese like to call, will be real win-win. What we are doing now, using tariffs as a cudgel, and I'm happy to go into that more, is not the same thing as a free trade agreement. It's something very different. So in any case, we've walked away from that kind of economic engagement. Now, U.S. businesses are still very heavily invested in the region, and we do things on the margins. We're trying to step up. The United States is trying to step up to do more in the area of infrastructure development, which is very important to the region. But here we get to this showing up part. President Trump's decision to exit Seoul after he talked to Xi Jinping and struck a deal before the APEC summit it just sends such a strong, loud signal that the United States is not there to really engage with all the other countries in the region, at least at the highest level. And he left center stage open to Xi Jinping, who is showing up, as you said. And China has stepped into that rhetorical role of championing free trade and multilateralism and regional cooperation and development assistance and infrastructure development. We have just left the stage wide open for China to paint that narrative of China as the reliable, dependable, helpful partner. And we have stepped right into the narrative that China has been trying to craft for years, that the United States is not a resident power. It is a distant power that is distracted and not fully engaged and not committed. And that has been a hard narrative to sell when we're a big security partner and we're showing up in so many ways on the development front, on the economic. But now that image is really starting to take hold.
Thank you. And I think there's a great key takeaways there, and I know we're mindful of time, so a couple of rapid fires to you both. So first, to Dr. Ramey, you talked a bit about developing relationships in Japan with a new prime minister and what that may look like. One question I have for you is you talked about predictability in the relationship. And as a former congressional staffer, I'm going to turn to Congress as perhaps a bastion of stability in many ways, where there are consistent people and relationships over a longer period of time. So looking at Congress, and again, since we are looking at legislative recommendations as something in this panel with CAPEC, but especially with the trilateral relationship, right? Where can the United States, and not just the corridors of the administration, but the legislative branch, look to stabilizing this relationship? And why is it so important? We've seen 2 new trade deals now with both Japan and Korea come out of Trump's kind of vigorous travel around the region. Where does this play into the trilateral relationship?
Yes, thank you so much. And before answering that question, I also want to emphasize the importance of showing up, if I may. Just very briefly, completely agree with you, Amy. It is important to to be there. Otherwise, other countries like China in this situation will be taking the center stage, and so credibility will be eroding. That's the same thing for Japan, if I may. For example, for the NATO summit this year, former Prime Minister Ishiba decided to cancel its attendance just at the last minute. He was fiercely criticized by his own party, and I think it's really important to show engagement. So I think Japan's role in this kind of multilateral meeting is also starting this year to keep the U.S. engaged in these multilateral frameworks, to try to continue to pull in the U.S. in these frameworks. So I think that's very important. As far as the trilateral between South Korea, Japan, and the U.S. is concerned, as you mentioned, the U.S. unpredictability and the fact that the Trump administration does prefer to strike deals bilaterally without having this a kind of multilateral, trilateral conversation. I think here again, I agree. I do worry about the trilateral relationship. One thing I can say is that there was initial worry both in Japan and in South Korea about having a liberal South Korean president and a very conservative prime minister in Japan. So how would that even work as far as Japan-South Korea relations are concerned? However, I think there is hope in the sense that the new president of South Korea belongs to a new stream within his Democratic Party that is different from Moon Jae-in's, former president of South Korea, Moon Jae-in's belonged to. So I think the new president of South Korea wants to avoid being seen as pro-North Korea, pro-China, anti-US. So I think they both, the new leaders, the two new leaders, both understand how critical it is to have this relationship going between South Korea and Japan. And I think they also know that pulling in the US will be more difficult. It will be the Trump administration that will need to be reminded constantly of the importance of this trilateral. So I think it is also an opportunity, the trilateral with South Korea, or the bilateral relationship between Japan and South Korea, for the new prime minister in Japan, Takaichi, to be considered as a softer conservative if she keeps a good relationship with South Korea. So I think there is hope. Their first meeting in Korea this past week went very well. There was a thoughtful gift exchange between the two leaders. So I think it really is going to be the third leg, the U.S. actor that will be a little bit of an unknown, of a question mark in this relationship.
Thank you. And Dr. Sun, you talked about kind of the end of proportionality as something in your comments. And we're looking at this BIS extension, BIS copy and paste basically in China on rare earths and permanent magnets as a significant escalation, perhaps an end of that proportionality. How do you view the creation of this from the Chinese calculus and perspective? Why did they choose to use this major card of theirs now? You know, many of us in national security were actually quite thankful they might have done this now to give us a chance to adapt. So what is the calculus in China around ending some of these proportionality constraints? And what does that look like for where we go using APEC and other forums to kind of respond to this increasingly aggressive China in both economic and military and defense domains?
That's a good question. So why did the Chinese decide to push the envelope? Well, I think for them, first off, because it's effective, right? Rare earths, in their view, since April, has produced a significant result in the policy outcome that they want to achieve. And I think they do understand that, well, if you look at their export restrictions, this is not the first time they used it. Back in 2012, they used it on Japan, and which led to, which is an interesting aspect that I think have not been looked at, which led to massive arbitrage and smuggling of rare earth minerals out of the Chinese market because of the price differential it has created. Domestic capability to produce is still there, but the export licensing was not being given. So it creates a significant price differential between the international market price and the domestic price. So I haven't seen a credible research on this particular aspect, but I think it does raise a question that, well, it will give US a warning that we need to meet our vulnerability, right? We need to develop alternative sources. I think there are two considerations here on the Chinese side. The first one is the crisis is today. BIS rule is today. If they don't have an effective counter, this rule will be imposed, and it will mean a very, very significant impact over Chinese state-owned enterprises and their affiliates and their operations globally. So they identify this as a significant enough threat that warrants a significant enough response. And the second piece of this is I'd love to hear the views from rare earths industry experts, because the Chinese believe they have at least a 5 to 10 year lead. So of course, US will try to develop alternative sources, but it's not something that you can create overnight, right? Mm-hmm. Which means that this policy instrument is going to be very effective for the foreseeable future. Mm-hmm. And rare earth is not just about the mining, that you excavate the ores from the earth, it's also about processing. Mm-hmm. And the processing is extremely polluting. And we've seen media stories about how China is willing to put up the cost. I think a number of Southeast Asian countries have actually offered the alternative processing sites for essentially to meet the US demand for rare earths, but that's going to take a number of years for it to transpire. Mm-hmm. We're seeing that the administration is taking measures to meet that demand, but it's not going to be quick.
Thank you. I think we're going to turn now to some of the audience questions. We're going to start with a question from Tao Hing Chong, which is, which ROK, Republic of Korea shipbuilder Hanwha Ocean, making a bid to build submarines for the Philippines? The Philippines agreeing to provide further base access to the United States military, and the US ROK agreement on nuclear subs. Do you see the U.S. taking more of a leading role to promote cooperation in the region? This is obviously a complex question, but I'm going to first throw it to you, Dr. Seawright, because of your role in defense in the past. How do you view Hanwha and this increasing shipbuilding deals playing into overall cooperation?
Well, I haven't looked in any detail into this particular deal, so I don't want to pretend I have expertise I don't. But as a broader point, there has been this shift towards really trying to integrate our security partnerships together into, whether it's the AUKUS agreement or lots of different trilateral mechanisms that are flowing around. I mean, even just the more mundane kind of activities of what, we do a lot of joint training with other militaries around the world, but, a lot in Asia with our security partners. And for quite a while now, there's been an emphasis on trying to add in other partners to do trilateral or multilateral exercises so that militaries are working not just bilaterally, but with a number of like-minded partners to, it has multiplier effects in terms of the kinds of security partnerships and maritime domain awareness and maritime security skills, capacity you can build up. So that has been ongoing, and I think it's a really positive development. And the more that we can do, President Biden, of course, last year hosted the trilateral meeting, which was the first of its kind between the United States, Japan, and the Philippines. And that was a promising framework. We didn't see a lot of actual security deliverables under that. It seemed to be a little more symbolic than really practical, but hopefully we're operationalizing that in a number of ways.
Wonderful. I think also we'll turn now to a question, or actually, does anyone else have anything additional to add on this? We'll turn now to a question from Aaron Charrington, who I believe is in the audience. Yes. Aaron, do you want to, I'm going to read out your question, but.
Go ahead, read it out. I'll make
I'll take the mic prerogative here. What do you believe we can anticipate in 2026 with China and Taiwan relations? And how do you anticipate that China may be favoring a soft power solution over a hard power solution to the Taiwan question? And I think we'll turn first to Dr. Sun for this one.
Cool, that's a great question. What is our Taiwan policy? I think that's a question on a lot of people's mind. Well, we know that in the Chinese calculus, Taiwan question is not a Taiwan question. Taiwan question in their mind is a US-China question, right? It's a question about US policy. And now we're seeing a very popular proliferating view in China that unification is at the end of the tunnel. We have the golden opportunity to pursue it. But when you push a little bit further, that, well, how are you going to do it? I think that the assessment becomes a little bit more realistic, which is that they're not counting on U.S. abandoning Taiwan. They don't believe that the U.S. will give up one China policy, regardless of what President Trump may or may not say in his future meetings with President Xi. The Chinese don't believe that will happen. But what will change, or what has been changing, is how U.S. policy affects the Taiwanese public view. When they look into the future, do they have the confidence that U.S. will come to Taiwan's defense? We know that this yimeilun, this skepticism about U.S. commitment, has always existed in the Taiwanese society. But now, I would say that with our non-iteration of our Taiwan policy, I think that's what the Chinese are looking at. That this will shake the Taiwanese public opinion's confidence in the U.S. commitment to Taiwan. And when the Chinese talk about peaceful unification, it's about coercion, it's about psychological warfare, cognitive warfare, to change the public opinion, because if the Taiwanese people do not believe that the US will come to their defense, well, maybe they will be more willing to negotiate an outcome with mainland China. So I think that's where it is going. Of course, it also depends on how the US-Taiwan interaction will transpire next year. This year, I would say there has been very little direct vow of support coming out of the administration. Lai Ching-te's transit through the United States, it was removed from the schedule or postponed from the schedule, whichever term you adopt. But I think the attitude is clear. Even without a policy declaration, I think people see the preference of the White House, that the prioritization of the trade negotiation with China, not letting the issue of Taiwan to come in the way. And I think the Chinese takeaway is this is great. So as long as we can keep the trade negotiation going, or have the trade negotiation be the most significant factor in the US calculus, then Taiwan is put on the back burner. And that's the opportunity that they can use to temper with the Taiwanese confidence and public opinion.
Thank you. I think since we're running short on time, I'm going to take the prerogative to ask one final question for all of you rapidly, in the same way that I would often be briefing a boss as I'm walking in the Senate. You all have about 40 seconds for this, but what is the most important key piece of advice you would give, having viewed the recent APEC conference and the direction that both the United States and China are taking around APEC, ASEAN, and the broader coalition? What is the thing that we should be looking at and addressing first, and why? And only 40 seconds.
You're talking about the U.S. government?
Yes, the U.S.
Well, I think that aside from showing up, which several of us have said, I think the United States is going to have to figure out a way to have a positive economic agenda, and not just be negotiating deals with the threat of extraordinarily high tariffs or modest tariffs. I think that does not play well in this region, to understate the case, and it really leaves countries questioning the importance of the United States as an economic partner.
Great.
Yeah. So I would say having an economic agenda, but a nuanced one. Yes, I think that's very important, and do not surprise allies in the region. That's something that's very important. So always consult with allies in the region is something that I would absolutely recommend. Yeah, you don't see it much with this Trump administration. There's always a little bit of undermining alliances and kind of transactional approach, but yeah, the surprise element is something that the allies in the region really are scared of. So please keep that in mind.
I will look at the trade imbalance. Well, this year, in 2024, China's total trade surplus vis-a-vis the world was $1 trillion. And I think that potentially stands to grow. And we'll look at what the data looks like next January, what trade imbalance China runs with the world and with the United States, with all these trade policies. And we know that, well, we've been talking about transshipment across the region, China using Southeast Asian countries as a backdoor into the US market for a while. That deliberation has toned down quite a bit, but it's not going away. So the transshipment backdoor into the US market, it remains to be a very salient issue. So when we look at just the trade imbalance between US and China, it also underestimated what China actually exports to the United States. So I think the trade imbalance data will be very interesting to look at.
Great, and for any of our Capitol Hill or administration audience listening in or in the room, those are your key takeaways if you need it. Please join me in thanking our distinguished panelists, wealth of knowledge here on the stage. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now we're going to hear some closing remarks from Dr. Marcus.
Professor, not a doctor, but thanks for the academic promotion. Wonderful discussion. Appreciate all the questions and participation from the audience. So many takeaways. Not enough time to go through them all. But I'm really looking forward actually to rewatching the video and taking copious notes. So what we didn't really talk about also is we've had some really interesting developments in the U.S.-South Korea relationship in the last few days. Since APEC, we had the Military Committee meeting and the Security Consultative meeting. And so look forward to unpacking that in a different discussion. But I wish I would have had a chance to actually be on the panel because I would have actually added some thoughts on this whole question of the U.S. promotion of security cooperation within the region, and I do think that this is part of the overall approach of America first but not alone, is also encouraging the allies and partners to actually work with each other and not always have to have the U.S. be the hub and the hub and spoke system. So this lateral coordination between South Korea and the Philippines in defense industrial partnerships in the region, things like AUKUS and Piper, which Adam and I have written about as great examples. So just a few things though that I wanted to pull out from the conversation I thought were particularly interesting, and we ended on this note of the need for a positive economic agenda that fits in also with reinforcing the mutual benefit of the U.S. Security relationships in the region. The way the PRC has been essentially moving the goalposts and the need to counter that. The fact that we really need to have a strategy to deal with the rare earths challenge, and this is going to require a sustained effort, and it's such an important leverage point for the PRC against the United States, South Korea, and other allies and partners, and the need to really say that this is just a temporary reprieve. What we saw, in this meeting between President Trump and Chairman Xi, it's not going to really solve the problem. So we need to use this time that we have now to move out smartly with the new strategy. The Taiwan factor really loomed large in so many of the conversations, and remembering that Taiwan is a part of APEC, I think, was an important point earlier. And this idea of the strengthening of other countries' support for Taiwan, even as we look at how the U.S. of course is just so important for Taiwan's security and their self-confidence going forward. And then another big element here was to recognize just how much the U.S. messaging, the U.S. attitude, the U.S. approach actually affects thinking in the region, and how we show up, literally and figuratively, is just so important for how so many capitals view both their own futures, their relationship with the United States, but even how to deal with China, which, as one of our speakers said, that no country in the region has any illusions about China, and is of course reluctant to engage in a trade war with China, given its leverage. So as I like to say, we're out of time, and so it is the end of today's conversation, but the overall conversation does not end here. So I look forward to seeing all of you at future Indo-Pacific Security Initiative events and joint events with CAIPEC and our Economic Statecraft Initiative. And as I said earlier, my sincere hope is this becomes part of an ongoing series that we'll be able to do with our new partners in CAIPEC to examine issues of interest for the U.S. Congress, for the South Korean National Assembly, and for broader audiences in South Korea, the United States, and around the world. So thank you all very much for your time. I encourage you to go to our website to read more about our work at the Atlantic Council on such a range of issues that we touched on here today. So until next time, thank you very much.